Hello students, how are you? I am making this video for you about using quotes in writing. I know that Professor King will also explain to you in more detail next week about how to use quotes in writing, but um, I also want to make sure that you have some ideas before she does that, because from what I understand, on Tuesday, that's October 4, during class you're going to need to choose a quote and write about how you're going to use that quote in your WP2. That's going to be a discussion board that you do during class on Tuesday. So my suggestion is to think about it a little bit before you get into class. If you have to adjust something based on what Dr. King explains to you during class, you can do that. But let's get started by reviewing this document that we started to study a little bit in our class on Tuesday. So remember that steps 1 through 4 happen before the quote. Step number 5 is going to be the actual quote, and step 6 and 7 happen after the quote. So that's kind of the quote sandwich. The middle is going to be number 5, okay? So step 1 is select a quote that strongly connects to the topic of the paper. So when I pop back over to look at WP2 Writing Project 2 guidelines, I see that you are asked to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs. Okay, so there's several paragraphs where you want to use a quote. The first one would be define linguistic racism. That would be a good place to use a quote that provides a definition of linguistic racism. Also, she wants you to include what is the general American accent in your definition of linguistic racism. That's another place where you might want to use a quote. And there were definitely sections of those two readings, the pervasive problem of linguistic racism and the United States of Accents, where you could find some of those definitions. The next one is at least one example of how linguistic racism is manifest in American society. So you're supposed to use an example from one of the texts. You could probably use more than one example there also if you'd like to mention more than one. The third paragraph is going to be how linguistic racism can negatively impact those who experience it. So I think that will be probably also a separate paragraph, or you might have it be together with the second paragraph. Offer your perspective on linguistic racism. You're going to have a paragraph where you talk about a time you have faced challenges communicating, okay? And then finally in the conclusion, what did you learn? And do you think linguistic racism is a problem? Why or why not? And if it is a problem, what should somebody do about it? So I think probably for sure in the first 2 points, you're going to need a quote about definitions, and a quote, at least one quote with some examples. So I'm going to show a quote with an example for the first one, because I feel like for the definition, everyone will probably write something very similar. So I don't want to overdo it, like show you guys something and then you feel it's hard to like write your own after you see someone do it. So I'm choosing an example, but you could definitely choose the same example. You probably just need to write it a little bit differently. So let's go ahead and work on that. All right, so we talked about selecting a quote that strongly connects to the topic of the paper, and now we're going to connect the quote to a main point from our paper, and we decided to do the point about examples from the readings about examples of linguistic racism. So I'm here, I need to introduce the quote by providing author or organization credentials and use the signal phrase before every quote. So I'm choosing a quote from Ansel Dua, Wild Tongue. You know that in the beginning of this reading, there were more examples from school and punishment that we were talking about that were also really good examples of linguistic racism. I'm choosing something that I don't think is it's a fine example, but it might not be the strongest example she gives. I'm just choosing it so that you can see a complete, like more of a paragraph written about it, without feeling like when you do it yourself, you're copying what I wrote, or you're like thinking about what I wrote. That's going to be a lot easier. So I'm choosing this as my example. By the end of this century, Spanish speakers will comprise the biggest minority group in the U.S., a country where students in high schools and colleges are encouraged to take French classes because French is considered more cultured. Now, to me, this is an example of linguistic racism because they are associating, she's saying that students are being pushed to take French, not Spanish, even though Spanish is a very common language and people need to learn Spanish because French is more like sophisticated or cultured, and Spanish is considered like not as high culture. So that's an example of linguistic racism to me, okay? So I don't know if it works to copy the quote, but I'm going to try to select it, and I don't know if it's going to work, but we'll see. If not, I have to retype it, okay? So going over to my document, I'm going to say, there are several examples of linguistic racism throughout U.S. society. Okay, so this is kind of maybe going to be my topic sentence. Okay, because in this paragraph, I'm going to show some examples of linguistic racism that are from the reading that we decided to do from the reading. Okay, for example, okay, I could say, remember what part I'm on right now. I'm going to be talking about introducing the quote by providing the author or using a signal phrase before every quote. So I want to talk about the idea that my quote came from Gloria Anzaldúa, How to Tame a Wild Tongue. And I can use a signal phrase, which would be one of these. Okay, so I don't want, like basically from here, I don't want to just put my quote. Okay, I don't just want to put, include the words right there. Why? Because I have to put a signal phrase to in some way introduce the quote. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so basically what I was trying to say is we don't want to just put the quote right away. That's called a dropped quote, when we don't have any information before the quote that provides some background or a link to our topic. So we always want to put something before the quote. In the quote sandwich, that's like the bread on top, because that is going to introduce our quote and give some background information to our quote. So I could say, Gloria Anzaldúa, a Chicana author, describes a few, I'm not using several because I already used it, of these in her essay, Wild Tongues Can't Be Tamed. Okay, so I wrote a whole sentence to kind of introduce her. It's not necessary always to write a sentence, but it's possible to do. Okay, then we can say, so she describes a few of these, so now I'm going to say one of them. So I'm going to say, for example, Anzaldúa notes, comma. So Anzaldúa notes is my signal phrase. Anzaldúa notes. So here I have Anzaldúa, her last name, and then I have one of my reporting verbs, notes. Okay, since this article does have pages, this is page 25. Okay, I would probably put in here next to her last name, Anzaldúa 25 notes, because that indicates that it's on page 25. By the end of the century, Spanish speakers will comprise the biggest minority group in the U.S., a country where students in high schools and colleges are encouraged to take French classes because French is considered more cultured. So notice I made a mistake in retyping it. You want to always catch those. Maybe you noticed that the word cultures is in quotation marks. In Anzaldúa's essay, it's in quotation marks. I'm going to just click over to show you guys that. So it's in quotes. So we would almost have like a double quotes. So just to know how to handle that, if there's a quote inside what you're quoting, you're going to use a single quote. It looks like an apostrophe. So this is actually correct. Doesn't happen that often, but it does happen sometimes. Okay, so now I can put my period inside the quotes. Why? Because I already said the author's last name and the page number. Instead, if I wanted to say, for example, she notes, I'm going to remove my period, and after the quote, I will write on Zaldua 25, close parentheses, and put a period. Okay, so this is called an in-text citation. I don't need the paragraph number or more information. I simply need the author's last name and the page number. If there is no page number because it's an online article, it's okay to just put the author's last name. So let's see how I'm doing on my quote sandwich. So I got my signal phrase, number 4, and then my actual quote, the meat, the inside part of the of the quote in number 5. I provided in-text citations after each quote. For this class, we are using MLA, that's the author's last name, and the page. You can see that in APA, which is American Psychological Association, which is used in some majors and classes, they also use the year, but we don't need to do that. After the quote, so we already got those, check. Okay, we got that. And then after the quote, explain what the quote means. Use several sentences to explain how the quote applies to the main point of the paragraph and to the thesis statement of this paper. Okay, so that can be sometimes the hardest part because we're trying to make those connections between. Now I need to kind of explain why this example is linguistic racism. So I'm going to type a little bit and then come back and tell you a little bit more about what I wrote. Okay, so after the quote, I added, this example shows that some people associate certain languages with their stereotypes or biases about different groups. So I said this example shows or indicates or illustrates. I'm not exactly repeating what I had in the quotes. I'm kind of saying, what does it mean? What's the greater meaning? Thinking more highly of French than of Spanish is illogical and unfair, since both languages are useful and represent strong, varied international cultures. So here I'm mentioning some ideas from the quote, like Spanish and French, kind of almost like comparing them in a way, but I'm saying I'm now adding my own ideas, like both of them are useful, and it's unfair to recommend one over the other. The linguistic racism that is described in this incident is not isolated to one person's experience. Rather, Anzaldúa is suggesting that many high school and college students are advised in this discriminatory way. So in this part, I might be adding some like other examples in my essay that show like an example of linguistic racism that happened to one person. So in this example, she's saying that it could happen to quite a few people. She's saying like it's a broader example. So that's why I felt like that was important to mention. Okay, I'm going to add another quote now to kind of continue, which is really just the next sentence. Okay, for a language to remain alive, it must be used. So once again, I don't just want to throw it in here, but for a language to remain alive, it must be used. Okay, we don't want to just put it in there. Every time that we add a quote, we want to do our process, which includes the signal phrase before the quote, the signal phrase before the quote. Okay, so instead of just dropping that quote, I'm going to say, she goes on to say, talking about Anzaldúa, for a language to remain alive, it must be used. So notice I didn't say her name or the page before the quote, so I need to say it in parentheses after the quote. That means I put the period after the parentheses. Okay? So now I'm explaining a little bit more about what it means. In other words, advising students not to speak Spanish threatens speak or study, let's say, Spanish threatens their cultural and linguistic identity and their ability to speak their mother tongue. It also ultimately results in strengthening the dominant language of English. Okay, so this is an example of how to use a quote. And I hope this shows you with a little bit more information some of the strategies that you need to use. So start thinking about what other quotes you could use, either from the Anzaldúa article or from some of the other, the pervasive problem or the general American accent one. Those will also provide a lot of interesting details. Hope this was helpful. Let me know if it was. Thank you. My recorder doesn't want to stop.